I hope everybody is keeping well and safe. As Rageshri explained, I've been traveling to India for many years now and have given a lot of workshops about English, the English language, all over the country. And one of the things that teachers often ask me is, why is English so difficult? Why is it such an irregular language? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'd like to start though by asking you all, please, if you can, to click or print your screen so that you've got a copy of this chart. And this shows the invasions in England up to the 11th century. And these are very important. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the influence of the languages of the invaders this morning. So the orange line at the top is the Vikings, and the Vikings invaded on and off during the 9th century. And they spoke a language called Old Norse, which had a big impact on English. And then the green, pink and blue lines are the very early invasions from Denmark and what's now the Netherlands and parts of Germany by the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes. And those are the people who are responsible for bringing the Germanic language over to the island of Britain in the first place. So they're very important too. They brought what we call a language that developed into Anglo-Saxon. And then finally at the bottom, the little blue line at the bottom represents the Normans invading from northern France in 1066. So please click that slide so that when I talk about the Norman conquest, you have a reference. And the next thing I'd like you to do is to click this slide. This is a rough diagram of the inside of the mouths showing the vowel positions, the main vowels in English. And I'm going to be talking about front and back and high. So it would be helpful if you could all click that chart as well, because I'm going to be referring to some of these mouth positions later. Okay, so why is English so difficult? Why do we have 3 words, all with the same pronunciation, 2 with 3 different spellings? Why do we have the word to with the pronunciation to in it, but go with the same spelling of the vowel, but with a different pronunciation, go? Why is it but, cut, gut and hut, but put? And why is the plural of man, men? Why is the past tense of fight, fought? I'm sure you've all got lots and lots of questions. We're going to be thinking a little bit about what's driving some of these challenges. One of the things teachers often ask all over the world is there a magic solution? Is there something that I don't know? Have I just not been told something? And I'm afraid English isn't completely rule-based. So it's not as if there is a set of rules that we can all learn, and once we've learned them, that's everything we need to know about the language. English doesn't work like that. It's never worked like that. There are just some things that are difficult and irregular and seemingly odd that we just have to learn, and that we just have to help our students learn. So there's no magic bullet. So I'd like to start with a little activity. You've all got a chat box. Please use your chat box to tell the Collins India team what I'm saying. I'm going to say 5 words in English as they used to be said about 1,000 years ago, and I want you to give me the present day equivalent. They're all fairly common words. There's nothing unusual here. So type into your chat box what you think I'm saying. The first word is wheat. Wheat. What do you think wheat is in present day English? The next word is quain. What do you think quain is? How would we say that today? Quain. The third word is chlaff. Chlaff. What's a chlaff? The next word is wait. Wait. And the last word is starn. Starn. So what answers have we got, Collins India team? What have people been saying?
Quaint, star, half, Star, half.
Okay, let's have a look at the answers. Wheat is white. Quain is queen. Hlaaf is loaf. Wait is what, and stan is stone. Take a minute to have a look. What can you see? What are the main differences that you notice between English as it was 1,000 years ago and English as it is today? What are the main things that you notice? For example, in the first one, wheat, which has become white, there are two main changes. The H and the W have swapped around, and we've now got a silent H, and the vowel has changed. The vowel sound has changed. What's happened in quain? What's happened in hlaaf, wait, and stan? Are we getting any answers? Comment in here?
I'm looking for the answers, just waiting.
So if we look at what, we see again that the H and W have swapped around and that the vowel has changed in value. If we look at hlaaf, that h at the beginning has completely dropped off. And in fact, we don't have that sound in English anymore. And the vowel has also changed. The vowel has changed in quain. It's become queen, and the spelling has changed. And in stan, the only change is that the vowel has changed. So you can see that there's been a big change in the vowel system over the last 1,000 years, and that there have been changes to consonants, both in how they're said and how we write them, and that we've lost some pronunciation. Some sounds have dropped out of the language. So I'm going to start by thinking about silent letters. So we're going to have a look, first of all, at the silent letter K, as in knee, night, and knife. Now, Chaucer, who some of you will know is a very well-known early Middle English writer, and William Shakespeare, early modern, would both have pronounced the K at the beginning of these words. They would have said knee and knife. But that sound has gone. It's dropped out of the language completely. We know that the sound was dropping out of the language in the course of the 16th century, and that it had gone by the end of the 17th century. And we know about it because in the early 17th century, people were commenting on it as a lazy pronunciation. Now, one of the difficulties that we have is understanding why language changes. And I've put up a picture of André Martinet. He's a very famous French linguist, and he developed a theory called the principle of least effort. And we might be thinking a little bit about this more today, because his theory goes that what our mouths say is what is easiest for them to say. So if we have to make dramatic movements with our mouth to pronounce a sound or a word, or if we have to do something that feels unnatural or uncomfortable or that is exaggerated, then these are forces and factors that can influence how the language changes. So he might argue that we lost the knee and the knife sound because it was just difficult to say, because it's easier for our mouths to say knife without kn at the beginning. Whatever the reason, we're not entirely sure. But English has a range of silent letters because the sounds have changed because of sound change. So that's one reason why we have a lot of silent letters in English. So if we think about the question words, who, what, where, silent H, because the sound has changed. If we think about GN, for example, at the beginning of a word like gnarled, that G has gone for the same reason. Some of these silent letters at the beginning of words have just dropped out of the pronunciation system. But because spelling started to be standardized in the 16th century, spelling and pronunciation didn't go hand in hand from then on. So the sound might change, but the spelling doesn't. Let's have a look at another one. This is GH at the end of words, and this is an interesting one because I know I've been asked about this several times by teachers in India. So GH originally at the end of words in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the Old English period, represented the sound h, which we no longer have in present day English. It exists in Scots in a word like loch, but we don't have it in English. I don't have it in my variety of English. You can hear that it's difficult for me to say. In the Old English period, what happened to the sound h at the end of words is two things. First of all, in some words like though and through and although, it dropped out completely. It became completely silent. But in other instances, in words like rough and tough and enough, it developed into the sound f. Now we think it developed into the sound f under the influence of the Old Norse spoken by the Viking invaders. Remember that chart, the Old Norse? Viking invaders. The influence of Old Norse is why h became in some words, but only in some words. We don't know why it dropped out completely of some words, but not others. But that sound change is in part due to the influence of Old Norse. So English encountering another language and adopting something from that language and then changing as a result. And English changing when it encounters other languages is a very, very common picture in the history of the language. Then, of course, we have took over the court, the government, culture, education. They became the rulers and the leaders and the masters in medieval England. And the original English, the original Saxon inhabitants became lower down, lower class, lower status. They were relegated to working on the land, working in the kitchens, serving the French masters. So in a situation like this, French became the high status language. English was considered, Old English was considered to be a low status language. And Latin was also considered a high status language because it was the language of the church. So these are very important factors in the development of the language. And in the 16th century, those pesky spelling reformers tried to make some words in English look higher status. So they put the B in doubt to make the word look like the Latin word dubitum. English doubt actually comes from French doute. In Middle English, they would have said doute. In early modern English, the vowel sound shifted to doubt, but it's the spelling reformers who deliberately put the B in doubt to make it look like Latin, to make the word look posher, higher status, classier, fancier. So some of our silent letters are down to spelling reformers adding them in the 16th and 17th century, not to reflect the pronunciation, but to make English look fancier, higher class, higher status. Just a little aside on silent letters at the beginning of words again, on GH, because this is something again that I've been asked about in the past in India. GH at the end of words either became completely silent in though, or it became the sound f under the influence of Old Norse, as in rough and enough. But GH at the beginning of native English words is down to the spelling reformers again, and they deliberately added the H to try and communicate in writing a sense of the supernatural, a sense of the fact that ghastly, ghost and ghoulish all have meanings that we should be slightly frightened of because they relate to the supernatural and things we don't understand. So the spelling reformers added those H's to try and make the words, the appearance of the words somehow reflect the meaning of the words. So that is a different, very different sense phenomenon to GH at the end of words. But loan words like gi, which English has taken from Indian languages, have different etymologies. So we're not talking about those today. The H in gi is there to try and reflect the original Indian pronunciation. That is different yet again. So lots of different things going on with silent letters. Some we lost because the pronunciation of the language changed, and we don't know why, perhaps through laziness. Some were lost because some were added because the pesky spelling reformers wanted to add them in. So different reasons for silent letters in English, and we just have to learn them, and our students, sadly, just have to learn them. Okay, so that's looked at some silent letters, and that brings us on to, quite nicely, onto pronunciation. Because as we see that silent pronunciation has changed, we've lost the pronunciation of certain consonants, but we've kept those consonants in the spelling. That brings us on quite nicely to start to look at vowels. And the vowel system in English is hugely complex and has a very, very long and complicated history. And we're only going to look at it a little bit today. We're going to look at these words, good, food, and flood. For me, I've put my pronunciation at the bottom of the slide. They're all different. I don't rhyme these words. I say good, food, and flood. If you were to travel to the northeast of England, people would rhyme good and flood. They'd say good and flood. If you were to come to Scotland, where I live, I'm not Scottish, but where I live, people rhyme good and food, good food. But for me, they're all different vowels. For Shakespeare, they were all the same. He said good, food, flood. But obviously, the language has changed since Shakespeare's time. So what has happened with these words is that in the south of England, in particular, the vowel system started to shift. And the pronunciation of the vowel in OOD shifted in different ways for a range of different factors, which linguists argue about. So we've ended up with a system in the south of England where there's been a shift that is different to the shift that happened in the north of the country. So now when you go around English-speaking parts of the UK, people have different vowels. And there's a range of very complicated reasons behind this. But what Shakespeare would have had as one vowel sound in the way that most speakers speak nowadays is 3 different vowel sounds. But again, because this happened comparatively late in the 16th and 17th century, the spelling didn't change to reflect the pronunciation. Here's another example from Shakespeare. So Shakespeare would have said words with EE and EA in them differently. I say meat and meat. For me, meat, meat, feet, feet, TT, CC, all rhyme. They're some of these pesky homophones that make learning English so difficult because one spelling, but 2 different pronunciations. He would have said meat for the EE spelling, but he would have said a mate for the EA spelling. So what's happened here is we think this change happened in the 18th century because there's some interesting evidence for it. What happened during the course of the 18th century is that most of the words spelled with EE subtly changed their pronunciation to rhyme with words spelled, the word spelled EA changed their pronunciation to rhyme with words spelled EE during the course of the 18th century. So mate became meat, fate became feet, tay became tea, say became see. during the course of the 18th century. Now, we know it happened then because we know we have some evidence from literature. If anybody's read Thackeray's Vanity Fair, there's an Irish lady. This story is set at the beginning of the 19th century. And he represents the way an Irish lady from Dublin speaks using the A sound for mate rather than the E sound that the English she was encountering were using at the time. And in parts of Ireland, they still have mate for mate, mate for meat. But that helps us date this sound change. The confusing thing, though, and one of the things that makes English difficult, is that these changes will have words with EA spelling, great, steak, and break, for example, that didn't go through that sound change. Linguists argue over why these words didn't go through that sound change. Some people believe it is to do with something called phonesthesia, which is how sound might have meaning, but that's a very, very hotly debated linguistic theory. But it does sadly mean that for us, when we're teaching, we have to teach that EA can say the sound A in words like great, steak, and break, but it can also say the sound E, as in tea and meat, and C, SEA. So these are all irregularities and difficulties that have evolved through the history of the language, and it's not a consistent evolution. Okay, now there have been several people who have thought about trying to reform the spelling of English to reflect how we say English. But it's a very difficult topic, because whose pronunciation would we take? Mine? The Queen's? Even the Queen has changed how she pronounces words over the course of her reign since 1952. And where would we take that pronunciation from? The US? The UK? Some people in Scotland say Scottish has the purest English. Perhaps we should take it from Scotland. So it's a very difficult topic. George Bernard Shaw was one of the great proponents of spelling reform, and he came up with this example. How do we say this word? Type your answers into the chat box.
So I'm waiting for the answers, Elaine.
Yeah.
I have something on Facebook Live or...
Yeah. Anybody got any ideas? How do we say this word? George Bernard Shaw came up with this. I've used it a lot, so if any of you have been to any of my presentations, you'll know.
Elaine, we've got two answers, one from Vandana ma'am and the other from Leela, Miss Leela. It's fish, F-I-S-H, fish.
Yeah, it's fish. And this is how it works. It's GH, as in the word rough, O representing the first vowel sound in the plural form women. So we've got F, I, and TI representing the sound sh, as in nation. And there are actually, I counted once, there are actually 10 different ways of representing the sound sh in English. But that, I think, is a conversation for another day. But we've got TI, SH, CH, SCI, CI, CE, all kinds of sounds, all kinds of spellings to represent one sound. So George Bernard Shaw devised this example, but it would be very, very difficult to impose. As I say, whose pronunciation would we take? And the language is still changing, so we might reform it and fix it, but it wouldn't be fixed forever. So at least we have a system that can be commonly read and understood. Okay, so this brings us on quite nicely to sound change, and I asked you all to click this slide at the beginning because I'm going to be talking about where we pronounce sounds. And I want you all to look at the word front, and underneath front you'll see a little blob, and next to it is the IPA for the sound E, long E. Look how I make it. If you can all see me, I make it by pulling my mouth back, E. And I want you all to look at the U with the length mark after it. Ooh, that's another very common sound in English. And we make that at the back of our mouths with our lips rounded. Ooh. So we've got E made at the front of our mouths and ooh at the back of our mouths. with different lip shapes. So we're going to come back to this, so try and fix this in your mind, and this is where we get really complicated. Okay, so as you can tell from the examples I gave you at the beginning, wheat, white, hlaf, loaf, stan, stone, the vowels of English have undergone a major set of changes, and one of these is called the Great Vowel Shift. And the Great Vowel Shift happened, we think, in around the 15th and 16th centuries. And what happened was this. So we have a word like doot in the 14th century, meaning doubt. Chaucer would have said doot. And during the course of the Great Vowel Shift, which affected all long vowels, doot became doubt. So it shifted where in the mouth it was articulated. So it went from doot to doubt. And this affected all of the long vowels. So E in wheat became I in white. E-I, oo, ow. So this affected all of the vowels in English, but it only affected words that were in the language before around 1400. This is how we know it happened in the 15th century, started to happen during the course of the 1400s, because any words that came into English after about 1400 were not affected. And this is another contributing factor to why there is no one-to-one correlation between our vowel sounds and how we spell them. We have pre-1400 doot, remember from French, D-O-U-T, doot. The vowel became ow as part of the Great Vowel Shift, and the spelling reformers put B in. Let's not worry about the B. So we've got doot going from oo to ow during the course of the 15th century. But then we adopt the word soup from French in the 1700s, and we take it with the oo pronunciation that in words borrowed from French several hundred years earlier have all shifted. So we now have the OU spelling in English, which reflects both ow and oo. Does anybody know what word we used for soup in English before we adopted soup in the 17th century? Has anybody got any ideas?
I'm waiting for the answers, both on Zoom and...
Because obviously soup as a food must have existed, mustn't it? Any ideas? There's a couple of words. We used broth and we used pottage. So we've still got both of those words in the language, but with slightly different meanings now. A broth would be a clear soup, and a pottage would be a very thick, sticky soup.
Someone has said
soup,
stew.
the French word, is the neutral word.
Elaine, someone has said stew, S-T-E-W.
That's different. That stew is different. That's got big lumps of meat and vegetables in it. So that is a slightly different meaning. But very good thinking.
And someone says porridge.
Porridge. No, porridge is different yet again. Porridge is only made with oats.
Wonderful.
So
someone says stock.
Okay. Great.
How about stock?
Stock. No, stock has a different meaning yet again. Stock is something that you would put into food to make it more flavoursome, and you might use it in soup, but it's not exactly the same as soup. Okay, so that's really interesting, because that brings me very neatly onto my next point, which is that another reason that learners and children and all of us actually struggle with English language is because we've got so many words. I mean, look at all those words that you came up for with things that you might serve in a bowl and drink with a spoon. You know, soup, pottage, broth, stock, stew, porridge. They all operate in a very similar semantic environment, but they've all got subtly different meanings, and we use them in subtly different ways. Porridge only relates to something that you eat in a bowl and that's of a similar consistency to soup if it's made with oats and possibly milk or sugar. Stock is something that you would add to give flavour. So they've all got slightly different meanings. So why on earth does English have so many words in its vocabulary? Because being able to navigate through the vocabulary is a real challenge for lots of learners and for young children learning the language. And particularly if we're thinking about creative writing in an IGCSE context or CB or ICS, creative writing needs lots of vocabulary. And cease and quit, they're all subtly different. So why does English have so many words? It's often said that to learn English and to master English, you need to have a much wider vocabulary than if you're trying to learn and master German or French or Italian or Spanish. And that's because English forms words in different ways. German often, for the most part, forms words by taking existing words and bolting them together. So fern, meaning distant, and seher, meaning seer, someone who sees, bolted makes word something new. Lockdown, for example, very familiar to us all. Lock, down, stuck together, one new word. Lovely. Thank you very much. But English also takes words from all of the languages that it comes into contact with. And this is why I was saying English is still changing, because we're still adopting words into the English language. There is not a comprehensive, complete, finite set of vocabulary items in English. We are taking words all of the time. So we've got chocolate from Aztec, we've got taboo from the Polynesian languages. Think of all the words we've taken into English recently, fairly recently, for coffee from Italian, cappuccino, latte, americano, espresso. They're all Italian words. We don't say frothy coffee, do we? We say cappuccino or latte. So we want to think a little bit about why has English taken all of these words and the problems, the inherent problems that come with them. Remember this? The Norman Conquest, 1066, we're looking at that little blue patch at the end, northern France. Now, the people in Normandy spoke a type of French called Norman French. I'm just going to call it French because for all intents and purposes, it is the French language. So the French invaded in 1066, and this had a major impact on the English language, on the vocabulary of the language, not so much on the structure and the grammar, on the vocabulary of the language. So the Norman French came in, over the sea they came, and they conquered and they invaded, and lots of Old English words were pushed out of the language completely by the French replacement. So the Old English word for fruit was wastum, but we don't use wastum at all anymore. That's gone completely. It's been completely replaced by the word fruit. But sometimes we kept the French words. So if we think about cow and beef, pig and pork, sheep and mutton, cow, pig and sheep are the native English words. Beef, pork and mutton are the words that we've adopted from French after the Norman Conquest in 1066. Can anybody see what's going on here? Have a look for a minute. Can you see what's going on? What's the difference in present day English between cow and beef? What's the difference between pig and pork, sheep and mutton? What do these words mean? Anybody got any ideas what's going on here? Can you see what English has done? It hasn't pushed the original native words out of the language, it's kept them. But what's it done?
So I'm waiting for the answers again. They are used as animal names is one. And the second answer is ingredients to cook.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So what happened is the English all became servants, and they were farming the animals in the field, where because they were all servants and they were all English together, they were using the original English words, cow, pig and sheep. I've got to go and tend to my cows. I've got to go and feed the sheep, things like that. When they were indoors in castles and manor houses, they heard their French lords and masters shouting for bœuf, pork, mouton, calling for food to eat. So in the minds of the English, the original English words became associated only with the animal in its live form in the field to be looked after, whereas the words that came in from French became very firmly associated with what their masters wanted to eat: beef, pork, and mutton. So the French words moved in and have taken on a specific meaning. They've occupied a separate semantic space in the language. And this is a distinction that English makes that French doesn't make, for example. So in French, the three words bœuf, pork, mouton apply to the animal alive and to the flesh when it's eaten. So sometimes words have come into the language and pushed out the original English, but more often the word has come into the language and acquired a different meaning or a different connotation. And it's where connotation, where a word comes in with connotation, that we get subtleties in meaning and usage that make the language difficult for learners. So let's look at these. Remember what I said about French being high status, Latin being high status? In the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, if you wanted to sound posh, well-educated, high class, high status, you littered your language with words from French and Latin. So let's look at begin and commence. Commence is a synonym for begin. It means broadly the same. It means initiating a process, starting something off. But they don't have quite the same connotation. Begin is fairly neutral, but commence is used in a more formal or ceremonious way. You wouldn't say, you wouldn't use commence at the beginning of a lesson, for example. You wouldn't say, I'm going to commence today's class by. But we might say, we're going to commence this meeting of the linguists of English. We might use it, commence, in a more formal or ceremonious setting. So it has a connotation that begin doesn't have. If we look at stop and arrest, arrest is from French. The French word that it comes from only means stop. The French word doesn't have any connotation associated with it. But we immediately know, as well-educated learners and users of English, that stop is the neutral term, but arrest has very, very specific connotations about, yes, stopping somebody in terms of taking away their liberty to move around, but it's got associations with that person having done something wrong, people in authority taking away their liberty, the police taking away their liberty. So it's got very specific connotations. And it's because of this that English has so many words in the language. We've taken words from English and French. We've retained the original English, but the words coming in from French and Latin have got very specific connotations, which mean they are not proper synonyms. They're not a direct replacement. So it's very important that when we're teaching children about synonyms and alternative words, that we help them understand the differences in how these words are used. But this is why we have so many words. It's because of the history of the language, and how whenever English has encountered a language, it's taken words but kept its own. So, for example, think of the different words that we have in English for habitations, things that people live in. House, flat, apartment, if you're in the US, condo in the US, and bungalow. Does anybody know where bungalow's from? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Anybody typing in an answer?
Yes, in shock or surprise. Okay, it's from India. That's what.
It's from India, exactly. It's from Bangla. And obviously the English were present in India for very many years, hundreds of years. And lots of words have come into English from the Indian languages. And we have bungalow because until the English visited, invaded, were in India, they hadn't seen houses all on one level. But now we have bungalow to indicate a house all on one level. So English has always taken words with specific connotations from other languages. This is partly why an examiner of English, perhaps examining for the IGCSE exams or CBSE exams, certainly for the IELTS and the TOEFL exams, which some of your students might want to do, a good English examiner can spot a learner at 50 paces because they tend not to use phrasal verbs like put out and break up. Phrasal verbs are very difficult for learners to use because where do you put that adverbial particle? If we think about pick up, Elaine picked up her pen. I picked my daughter up from school. Where does the up go? It can go either immediately after the verb, or it can have something else, a little clause of some kind, sitting in between the verb and the adverbial particle. And what about this? My aunt had coronavirus, but she's picking up now. That means getting better. That means improving. That means getting healthy and well again. That's got nothing to do with picking up. So they're difficult to use because how do you navigate grammatically those two bits, those two words? And they sometimes mean more than the sum of their parts. The meaning is sometimes idiomatic. So learners tend not to use them. They use instead one of the high-class words, high-status words from French or Latin that is just one word with a similar meaning. And they think, oh, I'll use that. It's a lot easier. So they'll say, I'm going to extinguish the lights rather than put out the lights. I'm going to destroy these boxes rather than break the boxes up. So an examiner can spot a learner because they try and use what to the native speaker are actually quite high status, slightly posh words that don't have exactly the same connotation as the very common phrasal verb. So this is why it's very tempting for learners to use single words when they should be using phrasal verbs. Now, not only are extinguish and destroy and the other single word alternatives, all phrasal verbs have them, the other single word alternatives higher status because they come from French and Latin. Does anybody know where the phrasal verbs come from? Anybody like to hazard a guess? Which language influenced the phrasal verbs, the development of phrasal verbs in English? It predates the Norman conquest.
They say it is German?
No, it's Old Norse. It's those Vikings, those Viking invaders. Old Norse has hundreds of phrasal verbs, and linguists believe that the reason that English has so many of them is because we heard the Viking invaders speaking Old Norse with phrasal verbs in, so that we copied that structure from Old Norse. So not only are they neutral in register, but they're much lower in register because of their history in the language. They predate the Norman conquest. Everything that's high status in English is after 1066. So you can see that the history of the vocabulary in English is long and complex, and that some words may well come in and may well have been pushed out of the language, like wisdom, but that for the most part we retain words in English and they acquire a different connotation. And a lot of that connotation is to do with prestige and wanting to sound posh. And wanting to sound posh is still a factor at play in everyday speaking and writing in English. It's something we all need to be aware of. It's not historical in the sense that it's no longer a factor. It's always been a factor, and it still is. We're going to look at an example at the end. I don't want to do too much work on the grammar of English and the morphology of English and why we have so many irregular plurals and funny verbs. But I'm going to have a look at one or two factors at play and to why the whole noun system and the verb systems are irregular. The things that we call irregular now are leftovers from an earlier system. They're left over from the Old English system. And the Old English system started to break down after the Norman conquest, partly under the influence of French, but partly because it was a complex system. And some of the things that the noun cases were indicating were done in different ways, and all kinds of complicated reasons. But our basic noun plurals now is you take your noun and you put an S on the end. So we take a new word like lockdown, and the plural is very easy to make. We put an S on the end. We don't do anything else. That's all we do now. So if we have a new word coming into the language that's been coined by someone, or that has come in from another language, we'll shove an S on the end. So cappuccino, when you go and order 2 cappuccinos, you put an S on the end. You don't attempt to use the Italian plural, which is actually cappuccini. You wouldn't say that. We just put an O on the end, an S on the end. It's very easy. And we show possession, and I'm not going to talk about the genitive case and possession today, with an apostrophe S. But I'm not going to talk about that. We're just looking at the basic plural, book, books. Old English had a very complicated set of nouns. It had cases: accusative, nominative, genitive, dative. So many of you will be very familiar with Sanskrit. Sanskrit has cases. Old English used to have cases as well. Present day English doesn't really have them. It's got 1 or 2 leftovers, but it doesn't really have them anymore. So we take our word stan, which we know means stone, and we've got stan, which is the nominative and accusative form, and it's plural, stanas. We've got stanes, which is the singular genitive, and we've got stana, plural genitive. And then we have the dative, which is used after prepositions, stane, stanam. So that was a very common way of making plurals. So you can see that the word stone had 3 plurals in Old English, depending on how it was used grammatically in a sentence. Stanas, stana, or stanum. Thankfully, we've only got stones now. But some nouns form their plural by changing the vowel. So boke had the plural bake. Does anybody know what boke is in present day English? And nama forms its plural by adding an N on the end. Naman. Anybody know what nama is in present day English? They're both common words. Have we got any answers? Any suggestions?
I'm waiting for the answers. Both on Facebook as well as on Zoom.
Yeah.
Yes, someone has given name, nama for name.
Excellent. Yes, nama is name. What about boke?
Book, book.
Book. Yeah, absolutely. So originally, the plural of book was bake with a different vowel sound, not the end of the word indicates changed. Has changed significantly and become much simplified. The majority of plurals are now formed with S on the end, but there are some leftovers. And the irregular plurals, things like mouse, mice, man, men, foot, feet, are leftovers from this earlier system. I'm going to talk you through the plural of mouse. Why is the plural of mouse mice? So first of all, the spelling reformers in the 16th and 17th centuries are to blame for the C spelling in mice. The C spelling in English for the sound S tends to be used in words from French, city, for example. So the spelling reformers changed the S to C to try to make mice look posher. Okay, so we can park the C. So the original Old English singular was moose, oo, with that long U sound, made at the back of the mouth. Look at the chart. You'll see it at the high up at the back of the mouth, the long U. Oo, with rounded lips. Oo. Now, the Old English plural for moose was made using a vowel at the front of the mouth, which we no longer have in English and is therefore hard for me to say. It is oo, moose. I have to really think about saying it. So the Old English worked 1 moose, 2 noose. Okay, now you can see where that oo is because I've marked it. It's shown with a Y in the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, and it's a front vowel, and you can see it's made in the same part of the mouth as the E vowel. Okay, so what happened, and this is where André Martinet, principle of least effort, is attractive as a theory, because try saying it, oo, oo. I find that oo really hard to say. So during the course of Middle English, the Middle English period, the plural for mouse, oo, became e, meese, possibly because meese was becoming easier for everyone to say. So Chaucer would have had 1 moose, 2 meese. Okay, with me so far? Then the next thing that happened is the sound became unrounded. The shape of the lips changed. So we go from oo to e. And the next thing that happened is the great vowel shift after Chaucer had died, and the E became I. So we now have 1 mouse, 2 mice. So that is why the plural of mouse is mice. So it's a long, complex history that happened over a period of several hundred years, but sadly, our learners just have to learn these plurals. They're all very irregular and very odd for very complicated reasons. We just have to learn them. They're leftovers. Now, I'm going to look at mouse because mouse is an interesting way of thinking about why the plural of man is men. This goes back even further. This goes back to before the Angles, Saxons and Jutes invaded England round about 450 BC. This goes back to Proto-Germanic, the earliest form of the Germanic language that linguists, historical linguists, have tried to work out what it was like. That is the precursor, the mother language of German and Dutch and English and Danish and Norse and all kinds of languages. So they think that in Proto-Germanic, the word for mouse, the plural for mouse was mooses. So this is where our chart is useful again. If you look at the word mooses, you can see that oo is said at the back. You'll see the U with the length mark after it, under the word back. And you'll see that oo and e are both made at the front of the mouth. So what linguists think happened is that the e in ease at the end of the word pulled the vowel in the first syllable oo to the front of the mouth. So the oo moved to the front of the mouth. It went from oo at the back to oo at the front. And then throughout the course of English, it then became E and I. But we believe that this change, this shift from pronouncing words with vowels at the back of the mouth to pronouncing words with vowels at the front of the mouth, we think that vowel shift, which is called the I umlaut rule, is responsible for the plural of man being men and the plural of foot being feet and tooth being teeth and woman being women. Those irregular plurals go back to before English was even spoken in England. So you can see that we've just got to learn these and that it's very, very complicated, which is why I'm working from a sheet with some of this written down for me. It's very hard stuff. And we have a similar thing going on with verbs. In the Old English period, there were a series of verbs called strong verbs that formed their past tenses with a change of vowel. And we have residualisms, leftovers, and they're irregular verbs today. They're called irregular verbs today, and we just have to learn them. So sing, sang, fight, fought. But most of our verbs, thankfully, are formed with just putting past tenses, just putting a D on the end. Love, loved, and any new verb coming into the language. Google, for example, fairly new verb, Google, Googled. You just put a D on the end. You wouldn't even dream of changing that vowel to make it a past tense at all. That's a very, very old-fashioned, Old English, Anglo-Saxon, Proto-Germanic way of indicating the past tense. Tell me, if you will, what the past tense of the verb dive is. Type that into your chat boxes. Let's see what answers we get.
Dove, dived.
So what are we getting? Dived and?
Dove.
Dove. Yeah, absolutely. What do you think is correct? Who would say dive is correct?
There are quite a few people who say dived is correct. D-I-V-E-D.
Okay. Who would say dove is correct?
Dove. There are some people who say no. No one says dove is correct.
Okay.
Everyone says dive is correct.
Okay. Interesting. Very, very interesting indeed. Very pleased about that. This is why. Present day English is dived. And it's dived because the original verb dive has a long and complicated history. And we have ended up with dived. It's actually two verbs that have got conflated, and we've ended up with dived as the past tense. Dove is used in American English. It's first attested, it's first heard of in the 1855 poem Hiawatha by Longfellow, and it seems to have developed by analogy with drive and drove, because obviously you've got the verb drive has got past tense that is indicated using a change of vowel. So we believe it developed in the US along the same lines as drive, drove, by analogy, as a later development. Both are right. It depends what you want to speak. I'm delighted you will want to speak British English and stick with dived. But if you have students, particularly higher level, older students, who may be wanting to go to the US to do university or study, they might need to be aware of dove as an acceptable plural, acceptable past tense in the United States. So that's where we've got dive and dove. Okay. I'm going to finish up with a last couple of examples. So this is a bit of work for all of you, shall and will. What do you use with I? What do you use with you? What do you use with he and she? What do we use with we, you the plural, and they? How do we use shall and will?
So someone says I will or I shall.
Okay.
We shall, we will.
Okay.
We use shall with I and we. So
okay.
These are the answers that I'm getting. And
okay.
From Facebook, they say we use shall with I and we. Both are correct. They believe both the answers are correct. Yes.
Okay. Does anybody know what the rule is? Or what the rule was?
Someone says first person takes shall.
Excellent. Yes. That is what the rule was. But it is sadly a rule that is still taught quite a lot in various parts of India. I shall, we shall, but you will, he will, she will, and they will. Now, this is the 18th century rule. This is not the present day English rule. In the 18th century, shall and will had very different meanings. Shall used to have a sense of obligation. It used to have a meaning very like must. Will used to have a sense of willingness, of wanting to do something, a sense of volition. So in the 18th century, it was considered very, very rude to say, you shall, because you were basically telling somebody, you must. You were not giving that person any choice. So it was considered to be the polite thing to say, I must, or we must, but we had to give anybody we were speaking to a choice. So it had to be, you will, or he will, or she will, or they will. That is the 18th century rule. But in the UK today, shall and will are both used in exactly the same way as markers for the future tense. I shall, I will have exactly the same meaning semantically, but they are used with different connotations. Does anybody know what the difference in connotation is? What's the difference between me saying, I shall give another webinar next week, and I will give another webinar next week? What's the difference? What am I subtly indicating with the difference in the use of the words?
So someone says, Ms. Shruti says will is most certain, and Shalini says I shall is not definitive. However, will is definitive. Shall is suggests probability, whereas will is certainty.
Okay.
So these
Any
are the
other ideas?
Will is a promise. Shall is doubtful.
Okay, that's very interesting.
So shall depicts probability.
Yeah.
So most people believe shall.
I'd really like to do a vote on that. Could you just email in yes in the chat box if you agree with that will is a promise and shall is doubtful?
Okay, so on Facebook, most people say shall is possibility and will is for sure. Will is an imperative usage, as most people think. Will is determination.
Okay.
So shall is possibility.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I think this is a feature of Indian English, because it's not the connotations that I have when I use these words. What's going on in the UK with the use of these words is that, remember what I said about high status and high class? People think will is neutral and they think shall is the posh word. That's all that's going on in the UK here. Is not that one is more definite than the other, but that one is posh and one is neutral. So if I say I will, I'm just talking in a very neutral way. If I say I shall, I'm trying to be posh and trying to indicate that I'm well educated. That's how we use them in the UK. I think, interestingly, I think this will and shall, and one is a promise and one is doubtful, I think that's a feature where Indian English is different to British English. So that's very interesting. Okay. I'm going to just, before I come back to what I think the implications are, I'm going to deal with this, because when we did a run through earlier in the week, my marketing colleagues said, everybody is going to say, this is going to be the first question. Why is it but put? Why is it one spelling with two different vowel sounds? So this is why. Once upon a time, all of the words spelled with that U had the same vowel sound. And the vowel sound they had was the sound input. Butcher, butter, cut, dull, full, pun, puff, put. The sound is formed with rounded lips. Remember, I had a photograph, and I don't know if you can see me, like we're blowing a kiss. Once upon a time, all of those words had as in put. Butcher, butter, could. Now, in southern dialects, in the south of England in the 16th century, the vowel in some of these words, not all of them, some of them became unrounded. We don't know why. We don't know what caused this. And we know that only some instances of the vowel became unrounded. So we went from to a. Okay, so we're no longer making a very rounded shape with our lips. So affected words included but and butter and cut and pun and puff, but not put. And look at dull and full. So dull and full. Full was affected, dull was affected, but full wasn't. That's curious as well. So only some instances of the vowel were affected, but not all of them were. Now we think that in the case of put, we think that put didn't go through the change because of the existence of the golfing term put. And we think the original vowel was probably retained to allow for disambiguation so that put didn't become put. John Wells, the linguist who wrote very good pronunciation dictionary of English, calls this sound change the foot strut split. That is why it is in but in put. It goes back to a 16th century sound change in the south of English that only affected some words. Now, when you travel around English-speaking countries today, including the UK, you will hear that in some parts of the UK, this sound change didn't happen. So if you go to the northeast of England again, they're going to tell you that what you spread on your bread is butter, not butter. So it happened in different parts of the UK, and it didn't happen everywhere, and it only happened to some words. So that's the explanation for why it's but and why it's put. Okay. So what are the implications for all of this? I mean, this is all really interesting stuff, and some of you will have done some historical linguistics as part of your university studies and will be familiar with some of this. Some of you will not have done very much and be thinking, my goodness, what an awful thing to happen to the language, all of these changes. And the fact it's still undergoing change. If we look at shall and will, it's still changing and it's shifting in different ways for me, and it's shifting in different ways for you in India. It's really interesting. Well, the learnings from all of this for us as teachers all comes down to making sure we're using the absolute best resources that we can to help our students navigate this. So to help our students navigate the complexities of the spelling and the pronunciation system, we need to be using good phonics materials in the classroom. And we really need to be teaching phonics, you know, to children in kindergarten, grades 1 and 2 and 3, but beyond into middle school, there's still a place for phonics in the classroom to continually revise the subtleties and some of the challenges and problems that the spelling system presents to us as we're learning. So good resources for phonics, and using phonics and a good phonic reading scheme like Big Cat to underpin teaching children to read is going to help them with all of those historical leftovers where there are differences in pronunciation and spelling. And then learners' thesauruses, proper thesauruses targeting learners, will help learners understand the difference in connotation between words. Anybody can go online and type in nice and get back loads and loads and loads of synonyms, but they've all got different connotations and they may all not be interchangeable. They're not true synonyms. They're near synonyms, not true synonyms. If I want to find an alternative word to nice to describe food, I might use tasty. But if I want to find an alternative to nice to describe what a young child looks like, I might use pretty. I wouldn't use pretty of food. That's inappropriate. That's the wrong connotation. So we need to be using proper resources. We can't rely on what we find free on the internet. It can lead us astray. We need to be obviously using good dictionaries. We need dictionaries of phrasal verbs to make sure that our learners really understand how to use these very, very common neutral grammatical vocabulary items that are a fundamental part of the language, and to stop students using high status single verb alternatives. And we need to rely on contemporary, current grammar based on corpus evidence, like the co-build grammar, and some other publishers publish good grammars. There's one very bad one in India, which I hope nobody uses, but we need to be using good, reliable, contemporary, current, up-to-date grammars to help us make sure that we understand how the language is being used and how it's changing. So that's what I would say. This is why this is all important. This understanding of why English is so complex and why that complexity is driven by the history of the language. We need to take that and make sure we're using the right resources to help our learners navigate the different challenges that we find in English because of all of the leftovers, because of the history of the language. And these are some suggestions for further reading if anybody would like to find out more. Do we have time for questions? I hope I haven't run over.
So I think we can make 10 minutes time for questions again. Hello?
Yes, that's fine.
Yes. So on behalf of Colin's Learning, first, I would like to thank all the 1,570 odd attendees for this event across both the platforms. Thank you so much. You've been wonderful. You've been very interactive over the chat boxes. So I should be pleased to take certain questions from all of you. So we would love to see the questions coming up. However, we've got one question right now, which is from Ms. Aarti Bansal Elin. The question is, ma'am, children have difficulty in finding difference in words with same sounds and different meanings. So how do we help?
Homophones.
Perhaps the homophones, yes.
Homophones, yes, homophones. Well, the best thing, you have to teach children, young children homophones. And this is where something like phonics and a book like Phonics and Spelling is really helpful, because it will build up a child's understanding of homophones step by step. If you Google, I Googled a list of homophones once online and came up with about 700 of them. We wouldn't sit and teach a child 700 homophones just as a list of words to learn and watch out for. We teach them step by step using a resource such as Fun with Phonics and Spelling or Phonics Success, where we introduce children to the sound and the words that are made from that sound, and make sure they feel comfortable with that sound and how that sound is spelled in those words. And then we introduce another spelling of the same sound and start to get children to look at the pairs. So it needs to be done step by step using some good resources, I would say. And I think, you know, lots of the good English courses that you use in India will address some of these challenges. But there's really the key into homophones is through phonics and spelling, and a course like Fun with Phonics and Spelling.
Thank you so much, Elaine. The next question is from Facebook, and the question goes like this, and this question is from Ms. Anisa. The question is, when we teach students language, we often get confused using American English and British English. Which one is more appropriate? I think this goes well with most of the viewers over here.
Yeah, that's a really hard a question to answer, because it's incorrect to try and talk about English in terms of, you know, what might be the so-called purist form, because it's a language that is spoken by so many people. And what's appropriate really comes down to what you think is going to serve your students best in the long term. So if you are in a school and you know that parents are anxious for their children to go and study at university in the US, then it may be more appropriate for you to teach them American English. If you are at an international school and students are wanting to do IGCSE, it may be more appropriate to teach them British English, because that ultimately is what they're being tested on in their IGCSE exam. So I think it's a really difficult question. You've got to think about what is going to stand your students in the best stead in the longer term. Lots of people now would say that's possibly American English because of the influence of America in the world. It's an enormous economy, you know, world's largest economy, huge education system, banking, business, really important for, you know, security. Many people would say that American English is the most appropriate one. But it really comes down to what you feel is going to be best for your students in the longer term. Thankfully, both varieties of the language are mutually intelligible, and there are differences, but they're not huge differences, and the differences are becoming lost anyway. If you talk to children in the UK, they will use what my mother would have identified as an Americanism, because they listen to so much, watch so much American TV, go to see so many American movies. You know, if you were to do a corpus search now on cinema and movie, cinema is the British English word, movie is the American English word. I bet you movie is coming to be more frequent now as the preferred term to describe going to a big theatre and watching something on a big screen with Salman Khan in it. So you know, it's getting fuzzy. It's getting fuzzy anyway. So sorry, no easy answer on that one. I hope that helps.
Yes.
Think about what your children really need, what your students really need. If it's IGCSE, then possibly British English. If it's they want to do IELTS and go to the US to university, then it may well be American English. But the differences, well, for young children, are quite maybe confusing. When you get to adulthood, you know, if somebody said, do you want to come and see a movie? I know what they mean, you know, and if somebody comes over from America and says, oh, you know, I dove into the water, I know what they mean, you know, they are mutually intelligible.
True. So with your analogy about cinema, I'm a speaker of a language called Telugu in South India. So in my mother tongue, if I were to say someone that I'm going for a movie, I would say cinema in Telugu, but movie in English. So that's how languages have taken these words.
Yeah.
So the next question is from Zoom, Elaine, and the question is from Mr. P. Nair. Mr. Nair asks, or Ms. Nair, Nair asks this question, ma'am, phonics at the early stage, especially at kindergarten level, would confuse the kids or make their base clear? This is a question. Especially when at the later stage, when they are introduced to spelling in the first and second grade. So technically the question is it good to introduce phonics in the kindergarten level?
I think if you're starting to teach children to read, yes, you absolutely should be introducing phonics. Phonics is the tried and tested and authoritative way to get children, to teach little children how to learn to read. You start them off with phonics.
Okay, and another question from Zoom. It is from Ms. Rashmi Patel. Mr. Rashmi Patel asks, phonics is like a Harry Potter spell for kids in India. Do you have tips for facilitators as to how can phonics be taught at middle school? Any good tips?
Middle school.
Yes.
You need to find some good resources. So Fun with Phonics and Spelling goes up to, I believe there are 7 books in the series, so there's at least 2 books there that would be suitable for middle school, and you wouldn't necessarily need to use the whole book with the whole classroom if you notice that your students are having a particular problem with a particular grapheme or digraph or phoneme. So for example, I don't know, let me think. I'm trying to think of something that might be middle school appropriate. Let's take EE and EA, where they both say the same sound. You can find worksheets and activity sheets that will encourage students to look at the individual words, look at the different meanings, look at the different spellings, and then do some activities built around that to help them really solidify and firm up their understanding. That's what I would recommend, is using some resources like Fun with Phonics and Spelling, or resources, worksheets that you can find online with your middle school students. But you as the teacher need to be aware, think about, oh, they're really struggling with this sound or this spelling. So for example, I did all of that stuff on GH because I had an argument with somebody once about GH, because they didn't believe me when I said that GH at the beginning of words, that the H had been put in to words of English origin, had been put in by spelling reformers. They said, no, it has to be the sound f at the beginning, so it has to be fastly, and fost and foul, you know, fool. How does that work? Why is it ghastly, ghost and ghoul? You've got it wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. So I had an argument with somebody about that. That's why I put that in. If they're struggling with that, find them a worksheet that just helps them with that. But it comes down to you as the teacher being sensitive to what they're struggling with and what they need help with.
Yes. So
and then finding resources, and publishers like Collins online and other publishers will provide resources that will help you.
So due to the paucity of time, I think we can take 3 questions and then we'll be perhaps done with it. So this is a very interesting question again, vis-a-vis pronunciation. Most people have asked me to request you to spell out the word POEM. How do you pronounce it?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, I know this one.
Yes.
Yes.
And ICSE also.
And ICSE. Yes. Well, for me, this word has 2 syllables. Poem. Poem.
Okay.
Poem.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, I think now all the 1,500
it's
odd
poem,
viewers
and it's
know how to
poem
this word.
in British English and American English. It's only poem for CBSE and ICSE boards. Everybody else says poem as a 2-syllable. Poem. Stress on the first. Poem. Yeah, you've got it.
Very close. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And, pleasure.
Yes, and the next 2 questions. Yes, the second last question would be, the present teachers facing SMS and WhatsApps. How should we tackle this as you in the classroom?
I think this is where we need to help students understand that English operates in at lots of different levels. So when we were talking about some words being posh, like I think shall is posher than will, we all do what we call code switch. So we all, whatever language we're speaking, we all adjust our language depending on who we're talking to and who's listening to us. So if I was talking to my MD, I'd make an effort to be quite polite, to use neutral words and not to say anything that might be construed as being a bit slangy, for example. But if I was talking to my friend or my husband or my daughter, I wouldn't be quite so careful to use language that sounds high status or posh. I would keep everything very neutral. And this is where SMS and texting comes in. It's completely appropriate to use emojis and texting abbreviations in communication that is done digitally using things like tablets and phablets and phones and in blogs. But it's not appropriate to use that if you're writing an essay or in an exam situation, or if you're writing a letter, or if you are completing a grammatical exercise or a grammatical activity or an exercise that your teacher has set to practice the use of vocabulary. It's not appropriate there. It comes down to, as I say, what we call code switching. What is appropriate for any particular setting? So it is appropriate that we say to our students, yes, you can use TXT to mean text when you are communicating in a digital medium, and you can be and you can be neutral or relaxed in your digital medium. So if you are sending a quick SMS to a friend or your parents, you can use TXT. If you're sending an email to your teacher, you probably don't want to use TXT. There it is more appropriate to use the word spelled out in full. So it's about helping students understand what is appropriate for any situation. And it could be that it's a written situation or a speaking situation. And then within writing, we've got the media that influences what we might write and how we might write it. We have the audience that influences what we might write and how we might write it. And we have something similar going on in speech. So it's about what's appropriate and helping children to understand that different things are appropriate in different situations.
Thank you, Elaine. And the last question for this evening, I'm afraid I wouldn't be doing justice to all the people on both Facebook and Zoom. The overwhelming questions. I think we would take the questions and send them to Elaine perhaps for our answers, and we can post them back. However, this is the last question for today, courtesy the paucity in time. The question is about grammar. Yes. So the question goes like this, ma'am. How to cope with present day vocabulary? Yes.
How to cope with present day vocabulary?
Yes, that's the question.
In what sense? In the fact that there's just so much of it and we have to teach it to students?
Yes. So,
well, I think this is going to be a really, really unpopular answer. But you all know what the answer is to improving a student's vocabulary, no matter how old they are. And the answer is read, and read for pleasure. That is the best way to help students increase their vocabulary skills and just learn more words and get a really good sense of connotation and how different words are used with different connotations. And it doesn't matter what it is, it's reading for pleasure. Reading Harry Potter is fabulous for helping students understand connotation and meaning and just learn vocabulary. You know, it doesn't have to be Dickens and Shakespeare. It can be Harry Potter, it can be, you know, anybody, David Williams, anyone. Reading for pleasure is the single best way to build up a student's vocabulary at all ages. And then, of course, you can do vocabulary activities and exercises in the classroom. But at the bottom of it all, the more a child reads, the more language they'll have at their fingertips.
Or even perhaps the Colin's Big Cat series.
Well, Colin's Big Cat is great for young children learning to read because there are over 1,000 titles at different levels, and you can give children to read that they'll be interested in. So a boy might have some technology things, get your reading. And I know lots and lots of teachers in India have said to me, oh, but ma'am, parents say to children, don't read that book, read the textbook. That's so short-sighted, because the best way to help young children develop the neurons in their brain is through reading. And the best way to help children develop the connections in their brain that is going to help them with logic and higher order thinking skills and maths is through reading. And the best way to help everybody develop a really strong understanding of the subtleties of English and how vocabulary is used is through reading. So it's a really, really valuable thing for our students to do at all levels, at all ages.
So thank you so much, Elaine, for that. Also, I recollect, I think it was in Kerala about 5 months back, at a school in his constituency, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, the former External Affairs Minister of India, MOS, External Affairs. Someone asked him, he speaks very good English. In fact, in India, we call him the walking, talking dictionary. So that's the level of his vocabulary. And someone asked him, sir, yes, you must have heard of him, Mr. Shashi Tharoor. He's an author. Yes. So someone asked him, a teacher or a student, someone asked him, sir, how do we get the kind of vocabulary that you've got, how to develop vocabulary. And he said the mantra to get vocabulary is just this. They're just the 3 words: read, read, and read.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
And thank you so much for inspiring us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me and listening to me today. Thank you.
So thank you so much, all of you, all the 1,600 odd teachers and perhaps even parents that have joined. We are really happy to have hosted all of you, and I think you've enjoyed the session. You've taken, I'm sure you take a lot of learning back to your students. So thank you so much, and hope all of you will again join us same time next week. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.